Genesis chapter 6. As I was driving home this afternoon after taking Michael home, some thoughts came to mind, began to percolate, if you will, in my mind. So the seed for the thoughts for this message. But many times it seems like as I'll get a seed or a train of thought, a particular thing, and then as I get set down and begin to collect my thoughts and scriptures and things, that seed of thought gets kind of buried amongst all the stuff. So bear with me this evening, if you will, in Genesis chapter 6, and we want to read verses 5 through 13. Genesis chapter 6, verses 5 through 13. He says, "And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And it repented the Lord that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him at his heart. And the Lord said, I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, and the creeping thing, and the fowls of the air, for it repenteth me that I have made them. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord." These are the generations of Noah. Noah was a just man and perfect in his generations, and Noah walked with God. And Noah begat 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. The earth also was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. And God looked upon the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted his way upon the earth. And God said to Noah, The end of all flesh is come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them, and behold, I will destroy them with the earth. Our thought this evening is taken from verse 12. "And God looked upon the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted his way upon the earth." And the title of our message is "The Course of Corruption." Now you think of the course here is like we speak of the course of a river. It's the way that it travels from its head and origin point. Many times it's just a little stream that begins in the heights and the mountains, and it runs down the mountains. And many of these streams begin to feed together and becomes a larger stream, and it becomes a river, and eventually a great river that empties out into the sea. And the path that the river takes is its course. And that is the sense that I want us to think about corruption this evening, when we think about the course or path that corruption takes. Mankind was corrupt because mankind had corrupted his way. And I have not studied that out to see if the word "his" is referencing to mankind or to the Lord. It fits either way, in that mankind has corrupted his own way, and mankind has corrupted the way that the Lord has established for man to walk in. And so we see that mankind has gone through the process of being corrupted. In James chapter 1, we find a description, and we find several descriptions that we'll read or reference. We've used these verses of Scripture many times in the past. But in James chapter 1, verse 13, he said, "Let no man say when he is tempted, I am tempted of God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, neither tempteth he any man. But every man is tempted when he's drawn away of his own lust and enticed. Then when lust hath conceived, it bringeth forth sin, and sin, when it is finished, bringeth forth death. And so we see that there are stages. There is a process that is followed here. And as James points out here, drawn away of his own lust and enticed. And they said, when lust hath conceived, it bringeth forth sin. And sin, when it is finished, bringeth forth death. Ultimately, he says, sin entered the world by one man, and death by sin. Therefore, death is passed upon all men. The sentence of death has been pronounced upon all mankind, for all have sinned. And that is the end. Sin, when it is finished, bringeth forth death. And so, we see here it describes the steps in a process. It is progressive. It is a progressive process. And as I was thinking about that, when I hear the term a progressive process, I think of sanctification. That's how we describe sanctification. It's a progressive process. And when you think about sanctification, it's basically taking back or uncorrupting, if you will, the lifestyle, the pattern that has been corrupted. It is a progressive process, a sanctification, and it's basically the steps and stages by which we undo the corruption that is in us because of sin. This progressive process is also seen, we see in Romans chapter 1. And again, this is one of those verses of Scripture that we've used a lot. We've referred to it a lot. We've quoted and read from it. And we won't necessarily read the whole thing, but verses 18 through 32 lays out this idea of reprobation and corruption in man when it says that verse 18, so for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who hold the truth in unrighteousness. Because that which may be known of God is manifested in them, for God has shown it unto them. So we began with a position, that God has shown us His righteousness. Those things that may be known of Him, He has revealed them to us. He goes on to declare in verse 20, for the invisible things of Him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even His eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. And then especially beginning with verse 21, he said, because that when they knew God, they glorified Him not as God, neither were thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. And as we will see in other scriptures, how this is one of the beginning points, if you will, of the corruption, is the vanity of the mind and the corruption of our thinking in seeking to be like the Most High God, to be as gods ourselves. And so, and it goes on to describe, it gets progressively worse. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. And it talks about the idolatry, and God gave them up to uncleanness, the immorality that resulted here. And then the perversion that comes about. And so he describes this progression. In order to better understand the work of sanctification, it would help to better understand how corruption works, since we must daily deal with its influence in us and around us. Now in James, where it gives that list, and it said, when lust hath conceived. Now that word conceived there in the Greek is silambano. It means to clasp, to seize, to catch, to take a firm grasp or hold of. And so the idea is we're tempted, we're drawn away of our own lust and enticed. And when lust, and that describes basically the power of lust, that we're drawn away of our own lust and enticed. And when lust hath laid a hold of and seized that, whatever that enticement is, then that brings forth sin. And then sin, the course of sin, when it is finished, because we don't just sin one time, we don't just sin in one way, we sin many times over the course of our life. We were conceived in sin, we come forth with a sinful nature, we come forth speaking lies, and all of our life is subject to that lust within us and seeking opportunities or finding opportunities to fulfill those lusts. And eventually it brings forth death. It brings forth a physical death. But beyond that physical death, there is the eternal separation from God. We're already spiritually dead. And that spiritual death results in our physical death. And that will result in our eventual separation from God through all eternity in the lake of fire in Gehenna. This is the second death. And so that word conceived there in James has that idea of laying hold of or taking hold of something. So lust, when it takes a hold of that opportunity and the sin is actually committed. Of course, Jesus points out that when we lust after something in our hearts, when we think of, we conceive that idea, we lay hold upon that, even in our hearts, before we even commit an act, he says we've already committed sin in our heart. And so, it's not just in the doing, but in our hearts. Our lust laying hold of that enticement, desiring it, and purposing in our minds, because we purpose in our minds to do something before we do it. You know, that's something that many times there are certain actions we can train the muscle memory to do without having to think about it. But you thought about, even that, you thought about doing that to develop that muscle memory to begin with. That takes purpose.
That's right.
And that can be a good, in a good thing, like firefighters, policemen, different ones, they train the military, they train to do certain things instinctively. They go through the repetition to build up the muscle memory, if you will. I even heard of a POW that in his mind, he played golf. And in his mind, he would focus and he would see himself, holding the club and hitting the ball. And he was in prison, he was a POW for a long time. But when he got out and got his strength back, he went and played golf. And he actually played better than he had before. Because in his mind, he had gone through it step by step, and he repeated it over and over and over again. And so he built up that memory. So when he actually picked up the club, he gripped it like he'd memorized it. And when he swung, he swung just like he'd memorized it. And he actually had improved his game in that way. Now, I digress a little bit, but the thing is, he purposed in his mind and his heart to do that. And so he built up that muscle memory. So whether it's a situation like that where you act instinctively without having to really think about it, but you've already thought about it, you've already purposed it, you've practiced it, and so it comes naturally. And so sin is similar in that when it comes naturally and we think about it, we purpose to do it before we ever do. And circumstances may intervene and prevent you from even carrying out, but because you'd already purposed to do it in your heart, that is sin. That's one of the truths that the Bible teaches. And it lays fallacy to the idea, well, you can look, just don't touch. That some people have that idea. It's okay to look and think about it, fantasize, just don't do it. No, that's still sin. You see. And so, anyway, this reversing the hold sin has on us, returning to the right way, is what sanctification is about. God has already established that right way. He's already taught us what is that right way. We have turned away from it because of that sin nature in us, that corruption that is in us. Our nature is corrupt, and that corrupts our way that we take in life. Things in nature, such as the river we talked about, the stream, tends to follow the path of least resistance.
That's right.
You know, people by nature, you give us a task to do, we'll look, what's the easiest way I can do this? You know, how can I accomplish this using the least amount of energy and effort? We seek for that path of least resistance. Well, sin does the same thing in seeking inroads into your life. Corruption, the course of corruption, will seek the path of least resistance in seeking to find inroads into your life. Now, Romans 5:12 said, sin entered the world by one man, and death by sin. Therefore, death has passed upon all men, for all have sinned. But it started with one man, Adam. But what did Satan do? Did he confront Adam? Did he tempt Adam? No. He sought to approach Adam through his weakest point, which was his love for Eve. That was his weakness. Satan saw that as his opportunity. That was the path of least resistance. If he could corrupt Eve and bring her under the curse, it would be much easier to get Adam to follow in that path. Eve was that path of least resistance, where his resistance was the weakest. That is what we think of here when we talk about the path of least resistance, is that way in which we're the weakest to resist Satan's temptations, the enticements. When in Genesis, God says that mankind had corrupted his way upon the earth. God had shown us the right way, the good way, but man has been seduced by Satan to seek after a different way and to call that way good. You know, as one of the things that, as I was studying this and thinking about this, that happens, Satan convinces us to follow another way than that which God has laid out for us, to follow another path than that which God has set for us, and to call that other path good.
Right.
You know, we don't want to think we're doing evil. We don't want to think we're committing sin. And so if that is the path we're on, we want to call it good. That's got the human nature of the situation. In Proverbs, and we see this expounded upon, and there's many scriptures, and I've got a few, and several of them here, 3 of them in Proverbs. Proverbs 14, and then we'll back up to Proverbs 12. But Proverbs 14 and verse 12, he says, there is a way which seemeth right unto a man, but the end thereof are the ways of death. So sin is portrayed in such a way to man that in man's mind it is right. Because death is a result of sin. The wages of sin is death. Death is passed upon all men, for all have sinned. And so he said, it seemeth right unto man, but the end thereof is death. That means that path, that course, is sin. And yet it seemeth right to man. In Proverbs 12:15, just back up a couple here. The way of a fool is right in his own eyes, but he that hearkeneth unto counsel is wise. But the way of a fool is right in his own eyes. Now here he's identifying this with foolish behavior. Now, sometimes we think of foolish behavior in a more benign way. But here God is characterizing that which is sin, that which is in rebellion against Him, as being foolish. And that is a very serious condition. And so it's a very serious thing when a man, it says here, is right in his own eyes. There's a way that seemeth right unto man, but the end of that way is death. Sin, when it is finished, bringeth forth death. And so it makes sense that that is foolish. Nevertheless, man thinks it is right. The way of a fool is right in his own eyes. In Proverbs 28, Proverbs 28 verse 26, he that trusteth in his own heart is a fool. Now he's taking this a step further. The way of a fool is right in his own eyes. He says, he that trusteth his own heart is a fool. Obviously, the next verse I want to go to is in Jeremiah 17:9, where it says, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Our heart has been corrupted. As we're corrupted from the inside out, not from the outside in. Every man, when he's tempted, is drawn away of his own lust. That is from within. And enticed. The enticement may be outward. But what makes that enticement effective is the lust that dwells within us. He's drawn away of his own lust and enticed. And this gets back to the heart. Out of the heart proceeds the issues of life. From within, out of the core of man, proceeds the issues, the adulteries, the murders, and all these other sins. It proceeds and comes forth out of the heart. And that's where he said, the fool trusteth in his own heart. And see, his own heart is deceitful. And that's the reason he thinks that his way is right, even though it's contrary to God. God has said, for this is the way I want you to walk. This is what I want you to do. And you take another path and go this way and say, well, this way is right too. No, it's not. But man has convinced himself of this, and this is part of that corruption that takes place. And he calls it good. Isaiah 5:20. Woe unto them that call evil good. And that it starts there. I was wondering about this before I turned and I verified and checked it. It says, woe unto them that call evil good. It does that first before it says they call good evil. The first step is to choose a path other than what God has laid out for us. When God created man in his own image and likeness, and that creation, he says it was good. It was very good. There was no sin. Sin entered when Adam, who was given dominion over the creation, when he sinned. Sin did not enter when Satan beguiled Eve. Sin entered when Adam knowingly disobeyed God rather than be separated from Eve. Sin entered the world by one man, and death by sin. Therefore death is passed upon all men, for all have sinned. And so it's through the male lineage, if you will, that Adamic nature, it's not Eve's nature, it's the Adamic nature that is passed on to all his posterity. And so, woe unto them that call evil good, and good evil, that put darkness for light, and light for darkness, that put bitter for sweet, and sweet for bitter. And so you see and the three things he lines up here, but it's always the evil, the darkness, the bitter that is first in the this combination, and it is called good. It is called light. It is called sweet. And so, one of the examples of this, we see how this manifests itself. Woe to them that call evil good. When God brought the children of Israel up out of Egypt, that was a good thing, and God brought them up to be His people. He brought them up out of bondage. But when Moses was up on the mountain, in Exodus chapter 32 and verse 4, the children of Israel, in their hearts, turned back to Egypt. And Aaron made for them these golden calves, and declared unto them, These be thy gods, O Israel, which brought thee up out of Egypt. This idol worship, this golden calf, that was evil. That was part of the Egyptian idolatry that they had been exposed to there in Egypt through all those years of captivity and bondage there for all those generations. And then it's to say, these be thy gods. These are the ones that brought you up out of Egypt. They was taking that which is evil and saying, this is good. You know, they're taking that which God had done and taking God Himself and replacing Him with these idols. Then in 2 Peter chapter 2, we see in New Testament terms, Peter warning here in chapter 2 verse 1, he says, But there were false prophets also among the people, just as there were good prophets, such as Isaiah and Jeremiah and all these prophets, Elijah, Elisha. There was these prophets, but he said there were also false prophets among the people. Even as there shall be false teachers among you. And so he's warning them that, and Paul warned that the men will rise up from your own number here and teach perverse things and lead people away after themselves and lead off disciples after themselves. He warned about wolves in sheep's clothing, not sparing the flock. He warned of these false teachers, these ministers of Satan posing as ministers of righteousness. Over and over we're warned about these things. Peter picks up that same train of thought and warning here, and there's going to be false teachers among you who shall privily bring in damnable heresies. I think Paul talks about, heresies and doctrines of demons. Here Peter refers to them as damnable heresies or false teachings. These are the teachings of these false teachers. They're not teachers of Christ. They're not men that God has called and gifted with an ability to teach His Word. But these are Satan's ministers, and they're teaching damnable heresies, and even denying the Lord that bought them. You know, it's the Lord Jesus Christ who has redeemed us. We are saved by His blood, not by our works. But that kind of comes under the heading of man's pride. That God has to depend on me to do something. He can't save me unless I help Him or allow Him or some other idea. You know, He's told me what to do. So when I'm baptized and I go to church and I tithe and I do this and I do that and I'm faithful in that, then God will save me. No, when you repent of your sin, put your faith and trust in Jesus Christ, no works involved. Then He saves you. Then, after you're saved, you'll begin to follow in those steps and those works that He has told us to do. But anyway, and so we see here how that they'll bring in these damnable heresies. And verse 2, and many shall follow their pernicious ways, their evil, deceitful ways. By whom? That is, these false teachers, and by those who follow their pernicious ways, the way of truth shall be evil spoken of. See, they call that which is evil good, and then to defend themselves against the truth, they have to call that which is truth, that which is good, they have to call that evil. You know, somebody's teaching salvation by works, baptismal regeneration. And we're saying, no, the Bible teaches it's by faith. It's not of works, lest any man should boast. Then they make up, you know, like we are the wicked ones. We are the evil ones. We are the ones that's teaching falsehood. That's their defense. And it's an old defense. It's an old, and this is something else, and I've got this in my notes at some point. It seems to come up right now. But he said, there's no temptation taken you but such as is common to man. There's nothing new under the sun. And so this idea of calling that which is good evil, projection, the things you yourself are guilty of, you accuse the other of doing. And we see it all the time. We see it in politics, we see it in religion, we see it just in mankind in general.
Right. In
business or whatever, in marriage, projection, accusing the other person of the very thoughts, actions, behavior that you yourself are guilty of. Calling that which is good evil. And causing that which is right to be evil spoken of. And so, again, we see this all the time. Malachi chapter 2, verse 17. Now, Malachi, we remember it mostly for the admonition on tithing, but in chapter 2, verse 17, that was part of a list of things, of complaints that God brings against the people here that had come back and was rebuilding. This was the period when they had returned from captivity and was rebuilding Jerusalem, rebuilding the wall, building the temple. And he says, you have wearied the Lord with your words. Yet you say, wherein have we wearied Him? When you say, everyone that doeth evil is good in the sight of the Lord, and delighteth in them. Or where is the God of judgment? So, when you say those which do evil are good, and this is what the Lord delights in, wants us to do. No, it's not. But to defend their own error, to defend their own wicked behavior. They say it's good, and this is what the Lord is teaching us when it is not. Matthew 15:9, where he says, in vain do they worship me, teaching for doctrine the commandments of men. These were not the commandments of God. God has given us commandments. He's laid out for us the things He wants us to do, how He wants us to do it, the way that we're to do it. He spelled all this out in the Scriptures, and yet man, corrupt nature, seeks to depart from that which God has laid out and do something in place of it, to replace that which God has said with that which man has said, and that which God has told us to practice and how He would have us do it with what man says. And that which man says comes forth out of that deceitful heart, that corruption, that nature, the damnable heresies, doctrines of demons, and so on. As a child of God, someone who's been redeemed and is in the process of being sanctified, we must beware of the wiles of the devil and the corruptions of this world. And here's the thing. We were a part of that world system, as described there in Ephesians chapter 2. You hath He quickened who were dead in trespasses and in sins. And He describes our life before the Lord saved us. We were a part of that corruption. We were corrupted. And the Lord has redeemed us and is in the process of purging out that corruption. And that's sanctification. But how easy is, since we were already corrupted to begin with, for that corruption to creep back in. And so, that is why we need to understand the corruption. We need to understand its nature. We need to understand, and corruption is a general term for sin and the effects of sin and the false teaching and all these other things that we need to beware of and be on guard against. And so I want to compare, because as we pointed out, and I'm coming back to this point, that there's nothing new under the sun. In Genesis 3, verses 1 through 6, when Satan approached Eve and he beguiled her, and she looked at the fruit, and there are three things that are mentioned there. That as she looked upon this fruit, and based on what Satan had told her, that in her mind came to these three conclusions. Now they were false based upon the lies that Satan had told her. But she looked upon that fruit that God had told them not to eat thereof. And she saw that it was good for food. It was pleasant to the eyes. And it was something to be desired to make one wise. Say, you'll be as gods. Now, how much, in Scripture, in describing the lost, describing them as fools, and yet in their own minds they think they're right. In Romans chapter 1, one of the things he says about professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. Professing themselves to be wise, they began to think and act foolishly, to trust their own heart, to say there is no supreme God, one God, but we're all gods. You see. The fool has said in his heart, no God. There is no one supreme God, but we are all gods. We can do what we want, you know. To say I'm the captain of my own destiny is to say I'm my own God, in essence. And that corruption, you see, here's these three things he mentions. Every man when he's tempted is drawn away of his own lust. And here we see those things laid out for us in Genesis 1 through 6. Good for food, pleasant to the eyes, desired to make one wise. In 1 John chapter 2, he talks about the lust of this world. Let me turn over there to get a little bit of the preceding verse. 1 John chapter 2. Verse 15. He says, love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. If any man love the world, the love of the Father is not in him. Again, here we talk about the world here. He's talking about the course of this world. He's not talking about the sky, the trees, the grass, you know, the water, the rocks, you know. That's not what he's talking about. He's talking about that which was described in Ephesians chapter 2 there, the course of this world. Love not the world, neither the things of the world. So for all that is in the world, and here he defines it into three areas. That, you know, that course of this world is defined by three avenues, if you will. The lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life. And that corresponds with Genesis there in chapter 3. We said it's good for food to satisfy the fleshly appetites. The lust of the eyes, it's pleasant. Oh, isn't she pretty? Isn't she this or that? You know, isn't he a hunk? The lust of the eyes, it's the pleasures, lovers of pleasures more than lovers of God. It's pleasing to the eyes. What was Samson said to his parents, you know, get this Philistine woman for me to wife. And they said, why aren't there any Jewish girls that you're interested in? Oh, but she pleaseth me well. She pleaseth me. Not a matter of what's pleasing to God, not a matter of what was pleasing to his parents, is what was pleasing to him. Lovers of pleasure more than lovers of God. Those things that please me. And the pride of life. Be desired to make one wise. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. And so these three avenues of approach. As we said, there's nothing new under the sun. These three things have been around from the beginning, from the fall. They was used to beguile Eve. And they're used over and over again in different ways to beguile and entice each one of us. It was certainly effectual when we were lost. And, you know, as a lost person, many times we're taught, well, it's wrong to steal. It's wrong to do this. It's wrong to do that. We've been taught those things. Our conscience tells us those things are wrong. But how easily we are enticed because we have that corrupt nature. We're drawn away of our own lust and enticed. These things are within us and a part of us. And how easily it is that we're enticed. But when we're saved and God has given us a new nature, a new man, created a new man within us, when we still have this old flesh, and with that same old nature, But our responsibility is like the children of Israel when they was to go in and take the land. We are to possess our bodies in the way they were to go in and possess the land. We have this corrupt nature that we are to purge out, we're to cast out, and take no prisoners. You know, leave nothing behind. But the children of Israel didn't complete the task. And as long as we're in this flesh, that task is not completed. It'll only be completed when God gives us the complete victory, when He comes back for us, and we're raised, and our body is changed, and this old vile body is changed, and this corruptible will put on incorruption. This mortal shall put on immortality. In that day, that is our victory over the very presence of sin, over that old sin nature that is within us. Flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God. Neither doth corruption inherit incorruption. That's the reason this whole body must be laid down, and it'll be raised incorruptible. And so, he tells us in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, there's no temptation taken you, but such as is common to man. No temptation. Every man when he's tempted is drawn away of his own lust and enticed. And so there is this course of corruption that is still present in the world that may easily overcome us and find, because there's still that old nature in us. And that's where we really need to be on guard. That sanctification process is the overthrowing of these things, the casting out and the converting of our life to that which is pleasing to the Lord. And it's step by step, day by day. When God gave promise to the children of Israel, I'm going to give you this land to possess for an inheritance. But He said, I didn't give it to you all at once. Here a little, there a little. You know, line upon line, precept upon precept, here a little, there a little. And that's how He gave it to them. It didn't give it to them all in one day, but many days of fighting, many different conquests, different enemies that they had to conquer. And even then, as it was divided up into the inheritance, each tribe, there was still some remainder there, and they had to go in. That tribe was responsible for their area. And so we have these areas in our life that we're responsible for. God has given us the victory, but our sanctification process. And so sin is the product of our own lust and nature, and lust falls into one of those three categories. And if you will, these are the paths of least resistance, where we're the weakest. We are warned in 1 Corinthians 5:6, or the church there is warned. This is written addressed to a church about its membership. And he said, a little leaven leaveneth the whole lump. You know, we're to be on guard. If you allow a little leaven to remain there, he said it's going to eventually corrupt the entire thing. And again, in 1 Corinthians 15:33, he says, evil communications corrupt good manners. So that intercourse, interacting with the world, if we're not careful, because that world is corrupt through lust, and we still have that old sinful nature, and it's very easy if we're not careful. That's the reason that, you know, we talked this morning about those rules of engagement. You know, not to make any agreement. Don't compromise the truth. Don't enter into these different marriages. And as I was studying, I used Ahab as an example, but Solomon was an example, and Judah. You know, of all people, Solomon. And it describes Solomon that he loved many women. Not just many women, but many strange women. That is, they were foreign women The very ones, and the ones he married they were from the very tribes that the children of Israel was told to drive out and not to make marriages with. The very ones. And what happened was, in his old age, he turned his heart away from the Lord, and he built them temples, he built them altars, which they offered sacrifices to these different gods. He did not follow the rules of engagement. And that's what they're there for, is to help us defeat the corruption, not that's so much in the world, but that is in us, and that seeks to lead us astray from that right path that He has set for us. And so, again, Matthew 15:9, teaching for doctrine, the commandments of men. 2 Timothy 4, he talks about the time will preach the word. Because the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but they will turn away from the truth and be turned to fables. This is why the friendship of the world is enmity with God. That's what he says in James 4:4. The friendship of this world is enmity with God. Such interactions will corrupt or turn us away from the truth, away from the good way. Now, God has told in Micah, it's recorded. Micah 6:8. Yeah, you know that verse, huh?
Oh, yeah.
Now, if I can find it, Micah 6:8. He has showed thee, O man. Now here he doesn't just address Israel, but it's a man. This is all man. He has shown all mankind what is good, and what doth the Lord require of thee, but to do justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with thy God. 3 things. Now you think they kind of line up with those other 3 that we find in Genesis and where's the other? James or 1 John? 1 John. To do justly, to love mercy, to walk humbly with God. Jeremiah 6:16, he admonishes, says, stand in the ways. Here's the different paths, courses that are available. But then he says, ask for the old paths, wherein is the good way, and walk therein. God has already revealed. There's nothing new under the sun. There's nothing new about what God has taught us to do and commanded us to do. He's taught us from the beginning. It is something that is retained in our conscience from the original creation in the image and likeness of God, I believe. It's that conscience is tainted, but there is still present that meaning that we instinctively know that it's wrong to commit murder. It is wrong to steal from someone else. There are certain things we instinctively know it's wrong. It's in our conscience. And so the old paths, the right way, it's already been laid out there. He says, you are responsible to search out, to find that, and then to walk in that. Unfortunately, Israel said, we won't do that. Why? Well, we have a different way that we want to walk in. We think our way is just as right. And that's part of the sin. Where, man, you shall be as gods. That my way is just as valid as your way, and my way is just as valid as God's way. And so, whatever's right in my own eyes, why should I give that up? Why should I reject that and turn to something else? Well, because your way isn't the right way. That's the problem. This is the good way, which contains the right paths, which we're to walk in. Proverbs 3, where it said, lean not to thine own understanding, but trust in the Lord. Let me turn over there, because if I try quoting that, I'm not going to get it right. Proverbs chapter 3, verse 5. Trust in the Lord with all thine heart. Now that's, the Lord gives us a new heart, new spirit. Lean not to thine own understanding. That own understanding would be that which comes from our old heart, which is deceitful. In all thy ways acknowledge him, or acknowledge God, and he will direct thy paths. Be not wise in thine own eyes. Fear God and depart from evil. Be not wise in thine own eyes. And so when we look at those things, he says to do justly. That corresponds with the lust of the flesh, the desire to satisfy our own fleshly appetites, to covet, in other words. Someone has a brand new car, and it's just the kind, well, I want that car. It's not that I would like to have one like that, but why does he get to have that car? I want that car. He doesn't deserve that car. I do. You know, well, that's not necessary. And if you take it, if you steal it, that's not just. You see, love justice. To do justly. To love mercy. Not necessarily that which brings pleasure to the flesh, but a godly love, an agape love, a brotherly love, to love our neighbor as ourselves, and so on, to love mercy. And thirdly, and this one really lines up well, to walk humbly with our God, as opposed to being wise in our own eyes, the pride of life. Instead of being puffed up with pride, to just simply humble ourselves, walk humbly with the Lord. This is the good way. This is what counters what Satan would do to corrupt us. These would block those paths of least resistance where we're the weakest, and actually strengthen those areas. These be the paths of least resistance that corruption will make its way back into our lives, areas where we are the weakest to resist. Once it has gained a foothold, it will spread, leavening or corrupting, tainting everything until it corrupts the whole, or it is purged out. And so he tells us in 1 Corinthians 5:7, purge out the old leaven. No, the old leaven, it's already there. Purge it out. No. And if you're purging out the old leaven, don't add any new leaven. You know, that's the idea. As Israel, as we said, was to drive out or purge out the old inhabitants of the land with their idolatrous ways, so we are to possess our own bodies and lives in sanctification and honor. 1 Thessalonians 4. First Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 3 and 5. For this is the will of God, even your sanctification. People think, well, I want to know, what's the will of God for my life? Your sanctification. Your sanctification. That's His will for your life. This is the will of God, even your sanctification, that you should abstain from fornication, that every one of you should know how to possess His vessel in sanctification and honor. That's His will for us. Even our sanctification. And that we would know, that we would learn